Hi class, welcome to our online lecture for Technical Description and Process, Chapter 9 and 10 from Technical Writing for CCNY. This should probably take maybe about 10, maybe about 15 minutes and should hopefully serve as an overview of the chapters for you. If you have any follow-up questions, you could just pose those in class on 218 or visit office hours. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so what is technical description? And I give you the definition here, and it's essentially using precise, concrete words or visuals that show specific features or parts or functions or physical properties of an object, place, or process. And generally, these are created for various purposes, and the book lists some. I give you some here. I'll mention some of the ones that are here. For instance, if a manufacturer needs to describe products for a patent, if they're trying to obtain a patent for a particular object, or for quality control purposes, or for the sales of that particular project, if it's, let's say, if it's observations that are made in the field and those need to be communicated to a client or to a supervisor, what the field looked like, what the soil was like, what the place was like, things of that nature. Or it could be observations that are made of patients while they're, fighting some sort of illness and so forth. I give you a description, an example of a description below, and you can see there it has the diagram, and then it also has some technical description as well. All right, let's move along. Okay, planning and researching phase. So your first question that you're going to ask, who might need the description, and why is this description needed? And then that will lead you to your next question, what details and facts should the description include? Where will the description be used? When will the description be used? And last but not least, how will this description be used? So this is no different than the 5 W's and the H that we've used prior. All right, next screen. So purpose and audience, as I said, I would mention these two terms ad nauseum. You'll probably eventually start dreaming about them. With that being said, what should your technical description achieve? And that goes back to your purpose statement. And do your readers want exact detail, or do they want an overall familiarity with the particular subject? And last but not least, in terms of audience, technical description is generally for a reader unfamiliar with the subject matter, but you'll need to adjust those details and the complexity of such depending upon your audience. Okay, so just keep that in mind as we start looking at examples from texts that we will read throughout the semester of description and how that's being applied depending upon the particular audience. All right, so how do we craft these? You can do background research on that particular subject. You can use your senses. Remember, we talked about the 5 senses, a sense of taste, touch, sight, smell, and hearing. You could take measurements. You could weigh it. You could look at its length and its width and its height. You could describe if it has a particular motion or it changes in some way, being dipped in a particular color or exposed to a particular light. Look for any type of movement patterns that you could describe. Look at its context, its surroundings, if that has any type of implications on the particular object or process, or how it interacts with other things in the environment might also have some impact on its description. And last but not least, if you're having difficulties with a description, let's say you're in a firm, you need some additional assistance, you are personally not a subject matter expert, but you can find one, then you ask them to fill in any gaps that you might have. Okay, to how to craft the technical description continued. Don't forget to think about color and weight and height and width and the length. Also consider the depth, the shape, the texture, the pattern. Something else that you could think about when you're trying to craft your descriptions is maybe the age of the particular product or object, its finish. Think about, furniture has a finish, but there's different finishes on certain objects, its moisture content, if that's important, ingredients that are being used, or the materials that make up that particular object. Think about a bridge and what materials are used to construct that bridge. Okay, so it was mentioned in last class, and I remember as we say, I'm building a layer cake, and partitioning a subject is something that you can do. And I give you an example here of a 3D printer, and you can see how the different features or parts have an arrow to them. And if I was writing a technical description, I might have a paragraph describing the viewing window, describing how the lid works, talking about the reservoir, the resin reservoir, and so forth. And I can have different paragraphs that describe each of those particular features and functions of the 3D printer. Okay, so this is just a way it could be used. And then I could have the visual also supplement the language that I craft. Okay, so this is another example of what partitioning a subject means that we've read thus far, but let's just talk about definitions. I've mentioned them before, but that's actually put them up on the board. A simile compares two unlike things or objects. Typically they're nouns that create a new meaning in some way or some sort of new understanding. And typically it's using like or as. It doesn't always, but it typically does use like or as. And here's an example, and this actually came from Global Shades, where one of the experts said geoengineering is like methadone. Okay, so that's a simile, an example of a simile. Now, an analogy is very similar to a simile. Okay, it shows two different things that are similar, but it's more of a logical argument, and it's really about creating a relationship based on parallel or connections between two ideas. And in our book, it gave us A is to B as C is to D. And just to kind of partition out, if you will, or parse out, if you will, the example the book gave us, circuits would be A, is to semiconductors, which is B, as tiny interconnected roads is C, is to a city's downtown, which is D, since they crisscross. All right, so that's an example of an analogy, and it's more of a logical argument. And then lastly, we have metaphor. And a metaphor is also a comparison of two unlike things, but here they're showing how the qualities of one element illustrates the qualities of another. So a heart is a pump. Okay, a CPU is a brain of the desktop computer. All right, so it's actually with a metaphor, it's not saying it's like something, it's not saying it's similar to something, it's not making a logical argument, it's saying in fact that it is. I, for instance, could say my boss is a dragon, and I'm saying that my boss has similar qualities of a dragon. They're angry, they can be unpredictable and aggressive, and so forth. So hopefully you guys are starting to understand the difference between the three. In terms of how you use those going forward, I would say metaphors and analogies and similes really take some time to be able to feel comfortable crafting your own. So I would suggest, as you read, notice how writers are using them and practice making your own similes and analogies and metaphors for subjects that you're familiar with, whatever you're studying in engineering, in the engineering program, or whatever you're studying in biology or chemistry, or a particular game that you like to play, and start crafting those similes and analogies and metaphors so you start becoming more comfortable with them before you actually start implementing them in your own papers. Okay, let's move along. Okay, Chapter 9 also mentioned this idea of a plain, simple style, and I do think it's important when you're crafting a technical description, your words need to be as simple as possible because you're generally communicating with a non-specialist, somebody that's unfamiliar with this particular language, so you're going to limit any type of technical jargon. You want to focus on the details that your readers need to know, not on the details your readers don't need to know. So it's this idea of trimming the fat. You want to avoid long sentences. So read your descriptions aloud, as I would suggest read any of your papers aloud before you submit them as a final grade. If it takes you, when you read that sentence aloud and it takes you more than a breath to read it, then that means that it's too long and you need to trim it down in terms of technical description. Remove any subjective qualifiers, those veries, those easies, those hards, those amazings, anything that is subjective that qualifies a noun that you're referring to. You don't need it. It's unnecessary space, so to speak. So be concise, get to the point, eliminate those, especially when you go through your revision process. Look for those qualifiers because they're just, it's a waste of space. Don't forget about your senses. I can't stress that enough when it comes to description. And think about how your senses, when you think about that particular object or thing, think about when you think about, hearing, taste, smell, touch, and so forth, think how you can add color or add texture to that particular description. And remember that your goal is to be objective. So it's just the facts. You're being devoid of any emotion or bias. You don't want to be subjective, which is interpreted as bias and emotion driven. So we want to be as objective as possible. All right, moving along. Technical definition. You'll notice in the last pages of this particular chapter, 247 and 248, they actually review an extended definition and how to craft one, which this should be a review to you on the lecture that I gave on 211. Okay, but I just want to point this out because you will be crafting your own extended definitions. It is helpful to actually see it written. It actually talks about a sentence definition. It's actually probably a little bit more useful than the actual chapter 8 in terms of this class. And don't forget, as I mentioned, add it to your lecture notes from 211. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 10. This will be very quick because we're not going to talk about instructions. We'll talk about them briefly, how they relate to process or how different they are than process. But here, chapter 10, it talks about what's called process explanations. And in our class, we'll just refer to it as process analysis, but they're both really the same thing, okay? And it's really being able, you need to understand the difference between process and providing instruction. And I give you a definition here. Process uses what I called expanding time and condensing time. And what that means is when you condense time, you're leaving out certain steps from the explanation because the user does not need them to understand the process because they're not replicating these steps. So you're going to leave out certain steps. But if you need to expand time or explain more steps so the user understands the process more clearly, then you're going to include those steps. And I give you an example on page 280 and 281. It gives you a memo that talks about, it gives you some instructions and also gives you some paragraphs that actually handle process. Look back at global shades. I think that's a really good example. We identified some paragraphs that are process, and look how that process is handled where time really is condensed. It's not giving every exact step that, say for instance, on how the disks get into space. It just gives us enough steps so that we can understand how that process functions. Okay, and then just last but not least, instructions. The difference with instructions, and they are a step-by-step explanation of a process. So there's not going to be a step that is left out because the user needs to perform this for their job duties in some way. All right, so that's the difference between the two. Okay, some guidelines for process that I think are important. I'm skipping some of the ones that the book includes. I'm just going to focus on the ones that I think that are important for our class. Guideline number 1 Again, we're back to know your audience and your purpose. You have to know who you're crafting this process for. You have to know what their needs are, what they don't need, and you have to determine what your process is, or excuse me, what your purpose is, why you are crafting this particular process. Is it to clarify something for your user? Is it to illustrate something for your user? Is it so that they can understand a particular process so they can make a particular decision about purchasing a new software upgrade? Okay, for instance. A guideline number 3 is you need to be objective. That's that key word, and it says POV, which means point of view. So you're not going to be direct here. You're not going to give the command, and that's a form of speech. Command is generally what you would use in instructions. Print this page, click on this button. That's the command. That's not how you're going to craft process. You're going to craft it in the sense where you might be using passive voice. And look at the example, like I said, from the paragraphs that we identified in Global Shades, and you'll see how it's not the command tone, that it's really some of it's really in passive voice, where the subject that is actually performing the action is not within the sentence. Okay, the receiver of the action becomes the subject of the sentence. All right, so guideline number 4 is make sure that you choose the right amount of detail. And that's going to go back to who is this audience and what are their needs. So it's really about the idea of, like I mentioned before in the slide before, this idea of expanding time and condensing time. You're going to condense the steps, the amount of detail, depending upon your audience, or you'll expand them out, include more detail depending upon your audience's needs. And then the last one is guideline 5. It's not something that we'll necessarily be doing in our class. I think it's just important to note that for complex processes, it might be better, instead of actually writing paragraphs, to use a flowchart. And if you're unfamiliar with a flowchart, I just tell you to see page 282. All right, so we have found ourselves at the end of chapter 9 and 10, and just as a reminder, I posted this on Blackboard, but I'll say it one more time. I will not collect these CTQs, okay? Since class was canceled, this is the way that I'm handling lecture. You should be up to date now, feel comfortable with the chapter. Again, if you have any questions, if there's time after lecture's been completed on 218, we can discuss it, or you'll have to come to office hours to have that kind of discussion. But you will, instead of turning in your CTQs, I did give you an assignment where you're going to apply your knowledge of definition, description, and process. It's posted to Blackboard, and it will be due on 218. Okay, that's all for now. Have a great day.